Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing today's seminar speaker, ya-wei Jake Lee. And Jake received a law degree from Cornell. And then for a while, he was in a commercial private practice firm representing various regulated industries, in particular the pesticide industry. In 2010, he left that position and moved to Defenders of Wildlife, one of the large environmental NGOs in the United States, where he developed their quite successful and influential endangered species program as their vice president of endangered species conservation. Beginning with his time at Defenders of Wildlife, Jake began publishing a number of influential and quite rigorous studies of the Endangered Species Act. One in particular that comes to mind is a superb 2015 study that he authored in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at about 88,300 consultations that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does with state governments, private individuals, to see how often development projects were blocked due to endangered species issues. That the folks who are interested in undertaking a project of some sort, activity, development, that may affect endangered species, need to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And given the frequent concern voiced by the regulated community that the Endangered Species Act essentially kills worthy projects, Jake and his co-authors subjected that to by far the most rigorous examination by looking at, as I said, over 88,000 times that members of the regulated community had consulted with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Jake has studied other wildlife laws and published on other aspects of wildlife protection, including the Lacey Act, a key law that regulates interstate commerce and wildlife, and has published a number of important studies related to that. Just this year, Jake moved to the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, where he is currently the director for biodiversity. And the Environmental Policy Innovation Center is using data science to understand the strengths and failures of environmental laws pertaining to biodiversity. Jake, I think, is quite skilled at combining both rigorous empirical analysis of environmental issues and laws with his legal training to develop policy recommendations that are both scientifically sound and legally sound. And underlying his work, I think, is a keen sense of pragmatism. That is, by virtue of his earlier experiences, he has a strong sense of how the regulated community views various environmental laws, and of course through his years with Defenders of Wildlife and now the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, how the environmental community operates. And he combines those viewpoints with his technical expertise to achieve solutions to environmental problems that are respected by and can be at least grudgingly accepted by all of the sides to some of these very contentious issues. And so it's a wonderful pleasure to have you here, Jake Lee.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for the very generous introduction. Thank you all for your interest in this topic. For those of you who have been following the news, you might have seen that the Endangered Species Act has been in the headlines of a lot of the national newspapers recently, and I can talk a little bit about that, including in a Q&A session if you have questions about that. So it's just a really interesting and active time for the ESA. Two things I wanted to just sort of underscore that David said that you'll hear as recurring themes throughout my discussion is, one is I'm really excited about the use of data science to help us understand not just how the Endangered Species Act works, but how other federal and state laws work. Historically, there's been a lot of reliance on cherry-picked anecdotes, case studies, and so forth. And what we're finding is that there's so many permits and other activities happening under these federal laws that the only way to really understand how they're administered is to sort of take 3 steps back and basically do a census, right? And now we actually have the tools, the data science tools, at a really low cost to be able to get this information. The federal government also is collecting more and more of this information, but they're not doing very much with it, typically because they don't have the resources to do these studies. So I think there's a great opportunity for those of us in the nonprofit sector, academia, basically outside of the government to try to get this data and help the government understand what it's actually doing on its own time. So I think that's one theme. The other theme I wanted to underscore is my work with both the regulated community as well as the environmental groups. I find that from a pragmatic standpoint, if we want these environmental laws to be sustainable, both politically sustainable, financially and socially sustainable, it's really important to sort of bridge divides, especially some of the more traditional divides we see between the regulated community and the conservation community, and see what opportunities exist in that space. I do a lot of work right now in agriculture and the use of pesticides for agriculture and for mosquito control, and trying to find how we can ensure that America continues to produce food, fiber, and fuel, is able to control mosquito outbreaks, and conserve endangered species, especially those affected by insecticides, is a really tricky balance right now, but I don't think it's actually possible unless we sort of reach across the aisle and work with folks on both ends of the political spectrum and on this issue. So again, those are just 2 themes. So just real briefly, in terms of what's been happening with the ESA lately, it's a really interesting time for me to come to talk about this topic because right now we are literally at the confluence of the federal government acting in all 3 of its spheres on the Endangered Species Act. First, Congress, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming has introduced very comprehensive legislation, over 30 pages of draft legislation to amend the Endangered Species Act. And a lot of the headlines are accurate. A lot of the changes would be pretty detrimental to conservation. And if those changes were to pass, we would see some real impediments to how we conserve endangered species in the US. Secondarily, on the executive front, the Trump administration has proposed some of the most sweeping changes to its regulations on the Endangered Species Act, more sweeping than we've seen in roughly 2 decades of the federal government. Those changes are expected to be finalized sometime in November or December of this year, so it's right around the corner. And I encourage you to look at, follow the news, follow our webpage. We'll be doing analysis about the implications of those sweeping changes for biodiversity conservation in the US. And then third, the Supreme Court just 2 weeks ago today heard oral arguments in a case involving this critter here. It's the dusky gopher frog. And it was a legal dispute about when the federal government can designate what's called critical habitat for the gopher frog. So critical habitat is habitat that's supposed to be designated around the time of a species listing. And it's been really controversial. It's one of these lightning rods of controversy under the ESA because a lot of people don't want their backyards designated as critical habitat. There's the perception that if critical habitat is designated in your backyard, there's a whole host of activities that you can't do. And this is a very, very common perception amongst the regulated community, amongst landowners. And I'll talk a little bit about the study I did that David mentioned that was published in PNAS to basically debunk this myth. So again, 3 very, very monumental events right now for the Endangered Species Act. And before I sort of talk about some of the challenges and the potential solutions to those challenges with implementing the Endangered Species Act, I just want to spend about 3 to 4 minutes to give you an overview about how the ESA works so that you can follow the rest of the presentation. So I just want to start with the listing process. Before a species can get any type of protection under the ESA, it first has to be listed. And there's 2 categories for which a species could be listed. The more imperiled category is one for endangered. And basically what that means is the species is currently in danger of extinction. And some 80% of the 2,300 species listed under the ESA are currently designated as endangered. The remaining 20% are designated as likely, as threatened, which means likely to become in danger of extinction within the foreseeable future. So the distinctions are disqualifier of likely, as well as looking into the foreseeable future, as well, rather than presently in danger of extinction. And so we have an example here of the frosted flatwood salamander as threatened. The actual plant species up there is Hibiscadelphus woodii. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN Red List, actually has a species as listed as extinct. It's only ever been known from 4 individuals, and the last one was seen in August 2011. So even though it's still listed on the ESA as endangered, it's almost certainly extinct at this point. And that's going to be the story with actually a few dozen endangered species that are still currently listed. So at the time a species is listed, as I said earlier, the federal government is also supposed to designate critical habitat for the species. And this critical habitat designation is one of, again, the most politically controversial aspects of the ESA. It's been the subject of many congressional hearings and a lot of frustration on the part of the regulated community. So this is actually a graphic I produced recently just to sort of visualize the taxonomic groups that are listed. And what I find is interesting is that when I ask people, think of the first endangered species that comes to mind, they oftentimes think of, the bald eagle, the alligator, pandas, tigers. But check out the 2018 list right now. Roughly 70% of all listed species are plants and invertebrates. And that's something that even a lot of people who work on endangered species conservation don't fully appreciate, that the bulk of what we have listed under the ESA right now are not vertebrates. And that was not the case, though, in the early days of the ESA. So 1973, when the act was enacted, we basically had no plants listed. And over the years, you can see just how much the number of plants have grown. The other really interesting thing is politics. So this is during the Bush years, and you can see there were almost no species listings during that time. And then starting in 2010, the Obama administration very aggressively moved forward with listing hundreds of species. So you absolutely do have trends in the last 2 decades based on political administration. And this underscores one theme, which is that politics has a pretty significant role in how effectively we conserve endangered species in the US. So once a species is listed, that's when things get interesting. In fact, the listing process, I think, is probably less than 5% of the big picture for protecting species, right? Once it's listed, there's basically 2 types of benefits a species receives under the ESA. The first is that bad activities are generally prohibited or restricted to some degree, and they can only proceed if the permittee gets a permit from the US Fish and Wildlife Service, or in the case of marine species, the National Marine Fisheries Service. And I mention this because although it sounds sort of really nuanced and specific, the permitting activities take up a significant amount of the dollars that the federal government spends implementing the Endangered Species Act. So reviewing permits, approving them, costs a lot of money for the federal government, and it's a major source of activity under the ESA, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But bottom line is that there's certain levels of bad activities that are prohibited unless you get a permit. One of the most important ones is this prohibition on what we call take of a species. And take basically refers to a whole host of activities, including killing, harassing, harming, pursuing, attempting to do any of those things, but also modifying habitat that actually results in death or injury of an endangered species. And that was a pretty innovative thing for the Endangered Species Act because unlike the laws of many other countries, which only prohibit, again, the actual killing or injury of a species, in the US, habitat destruction is regulated under the ESA if that destruction results in death or injury of a species. And that's really significant because a lot of habitat alteration projects are regulated under the ESA because of this habitat provision of the take prohibition. So we have that prohibition. The other one I wanted to mention, because I'm going to return to this later, is something that David mentioned earlier, that all federal agencies have this obligation to ensure that their activities aren't going to jeopardize the continued existence of a species or destroy the critical habitat of a species. So again, just want to emphasize there's two prohibitions here. You can't jeopardize the existence of a species, and you can't destroy its critical habitat. And I'll be returning to these later because these are some of the most controversial aspects of the ESA and the subject of over a dozen congressional hearings within the last decade and a half. But bottom line is, that's the prohibitions as well as how you get permits to allow for highway expansions, residential complexes, shopping malls, all of the things that we use on a daily basis. Many of them are actually permitted under the ESA because they do have effects on endangered species. The other thing I wanted to talk about is recovery. So simply prohibiting bad things from happening isn't going to get most species to recovery, right? You actually have to do things to improve the species habitat, reintroduce populations. So that also happens under the ESA. And the roadmap for how do you recover species is a document called the Recovery Plan. So recovery plans are mandatory under the ESA. Once a species is listed, the federal government has some amount of time to issue a recovery plan. But what's important is that there is no requirement to do anything written in the recovery plan. In other words, the recovery plan typically doesn't have the force of law. It's a guidance document. And that is one of the challenges with why we don't see more species recovery, right? A lot of recovery plans basically sit on shelves for many years. Some of the actions are implemented, but many others are ignored. There's no money to do anything under those recovery plans. And so simply having a plan isn't enough. That's sort of the bottom line. There has to be some way to actually follow through on all the conservation actions in the plan. This is an example of one of the 54 species that has been recovered under the ESA, the Louisiana black bear. It was listed in 1992. 3 years later, it got a recovery plan. Roughly 2 decades later, it was successfully recovered. And then 2 years later, there was a lawsuit challenging the Fish and Wildlife Service's decision to deem the species recovered. And there have been a number of species that have been deemed recovered only to be challenged by various conservation groups because those groups disagreed with the government's assessment of whether or not the species was actually recovered. So that's recovery in a sort of nutshell. And what I want to turn to next is the ESA actually working to recover species, to conserve species? That's been one of the most sort of politically hot topic issues under the ESA these days. And you basically have two camps. And I'll sort of summarize the arguments on both camps. And you can think about what camp you fall in or whether you're undecided on that question. So my view is it's a sort of mixed record. And what we have is in the 45 years the ESA has been around, there's been 54 species that have been recovered, many of them in recent years, really in the last 2 decades. And so the critics of the Endangered Species Act, many of the Republicans in the Senate and the House who want to reform the Endangered Species Act, point to this and say it's a complete failure, right? Only 3% of listed species have been recovered. Look, we're spending our billions of dollars the wrong way. We need to rewrite the Endangered Species Act in a way that's much more friendly to X, Y, and Z, right? So that's one camp. And the data are correct. In fact, only 3% of species have been recovered under the ESA. The environmental community, and certainly I said this when I was at Defenders of Wildlife, sort of points to a different set of data set, which is that there have only been 11 confirmed extinctions in this 45-year period. And they point to this as a success because it actually shows that roughly 99% of all the species that have been listed are still around today. And so that seems to be a pretty decent gauge of success. Although we only recently found out that the actual number of species that are likely extinct is much higher than this, but by and large, let's just assume it's 1%, right? So we have 3% and we have 1%. So what's missing from this picture? Exactly. So what's happening with all the other species in the middle, right? The remaining 96%. Surprisingly, that is not a real topic of political discourse right now. And the reason is it's actually pretty hard to figure out what's happening with the remaining 96%. There is not a mandate that Congress has placed on the federal agencies to accurately and systematically report the status of those species. The closest we came to is actually this study that I was a part of in 2016 that was published in Issues in Ecology. And this is looking at data sets from 1998, actually 1988 through 2010. And what we found was that if you look at the government's own data sets for how they think species are doing, roughly half of the species are in long-term decline after they're listed. And the other half are stable or improving, right? And we have roughly 2% where we really have no idea what the status is. So I actually think this is probably the most useful gauge of how the ESA is working. But unfortunately, the measure is really coarse. This data is really, really imperfect. It's based on Fish and Wildlife Service biologists oftentimes sitting in their kitchen, on their kitchen counter, trying to, indicate whether a species is improving, stable, declining, or so forth. And so one project I'm working on right now with the federal government is to come up with a much more accurate system to track what's happening in the middle. In other words, looking at not just whether the species is stable, improving, or declining, but why and how close it is to recovery, right? Because simply because a species is declining, you actually don't know, is it declining because, at a point where it's really close to recovery, or is it much closer to extinction spectrum and it's still declining? You want to treat both of those situations really differently, and there are some really good ways to do that, but the federal government hasn't adopted it yet. So some of my work with both Congress as well as the federal agencies is to try to get them to adopt these better systems to actually figure out how species are doing under the ESA, and as a result, we can have a much better sense of what the return on investment is for conservation. So if I lobby Congress to say, we want another $20 million for endangered species conservation in the next 5 years, the question I get is, what do we get for that money, right? What species are going to be saved? What are the metrics that we're going to gauge success by? Right now, we don't really have an answer to those questions. And so it makes it really hard to aggressively and successfully lobby for more money, because it's really hard to make a case for what the ROI is. And this is a situation where I think science can really help play a role in convincing the government that it can be worthwhile to invest in conservation. And you're not just throwing your money into this vast black hole where you don't know what you're going to get from it. There are some metrics that you can use to gauge success. So that's one strategy I see of improving conservation. So one issue question is, so why do we not see more successes under the ESA? Why do we only see 3% of species recovered and roughly 50% of them in long-term decline? As with many things, follow the money, right? And I want to talk about how funding plays a really important role in that. There's nothing really revelational if I tell you that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government doesn't have enough money for conservation. Even the US military, which gets a lot more money than conservation, will say it doesn't have enough money, right? So that's nothing new. But what we're really starting to understand in the last few years is just how deep the funding shortfalls are and what are the implications on a day-to-day basis for conservation. And I want to summarize some of my research and the research of some of my colleagues on this issue. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Leah Gerber, published this really interesting study 2 years ago that looked for the first time at how much it would cost to recover all endangered species if you looked at the recovery plans and how much those plans indicate would be needed for recovery. And then compare that to how much money is actually available from the federal and state government. And long story short, less than 25% of the $1.2 billion needed each year are actually allocated by the federal and state governments for conservation. And this data set was actually based on numbers through 2012. The situation has gotten even more dire since then because there's been a huge uptick in the number of listed species, but actually not a corresponding increase in amount of funding, right? So this picture is getting worse. And roughly only 20% of species are getting as much or more funding than that prescribed in the recovery plans. The vast majority of species are really, really underfunded. And so this is kind of the state of the world as of a few years ago. And so one question I had is it getting worse or is it getting better? And if so, what does the trend look like? So this is a little study I put together that looked at the per species funding adjusted for inflation through 2016 dollars. And what we saw is that there's actually been an increase in funding since 95 to 2010. But since 2010, there's been actually a pretty steep drop in funding in the endangered species budget of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the reason is the pace at which species are being listed is so much faster than the pace at which Congress is funding conservation, right? So I want you to keep this in mind because when you look at, when you hear, when you look at news articles and you hear about the great things that are being done to aggressively get species listed, that's fabulous. That's really important work. But on the other hand, what you oftentimes don't hear is whether there's corresponding money and effort on the back end to actually carry out the conservation measures that are needed to make the listing meaningful, right? Because simply getting a species listed doesn't automatically lead to much of anything for the species these days. And the sort of dire situation right now is that we're actually seeing less and less money available on a per species basis when there wasn't enough to begin with, right? So that's the second problem. Again, not enough. We have a trend that's negative. And then the third problem is this. This was also from this 2016 study I was part of, that if you look at how the federal and state government spends its money, roughly 80% of that money is spent on 5% of species, and 5% of the money is spent on roughly 80% of the species. So what we see is that even if the available money, a lot of it is actually spent disproportionately on certain groups of species. So what are those? So this was also part of this 2016 study based on 2012 numbers that the Fish and Wildlife Service released to Congress. This trend is basically the same every year. If we were to run it on 2017 numbers, it's roughly the same. So fish, they get a lot of money, but not all fish. If we were to actually break down fish here, the Pacific salmon get a disproportionate amount of funding. Many of you are nodding your head, so you probably already know this. But salmon are quite expensive to conserve, and they get a lot of funding. So even though of the roughly 1,200 species that were listed, less than 20% of them were fish as of the time of this study, fish were getting 61.5% of all the money. Next followed by birds, mammals, so plants, which I talked about earlier. Roughly 3% of funding. So taxonomic biases are really significant right now, and it's one reason I think we don't see more recoveries and more successes under the ESA. And whether that's a good thing or not is not really something for me to judge, because one could argue that, in fact, we care more about fishes. We care more about these really expensive species to conserve. And that's really not a science or even a legal argument, right? It's a value judgment about what we think is most important. But at the same time, if the opponents of the ESA want to see more success, and if the conservation community is in denial that the ESA is structurally flawed, that in fact it can conserve and recover a lot more species, then we're not spending money in a way that maximizes the number of species that are conserved, right? If we really want, if it's a numbers game, if we want to maximize the number of species that are recovered, probably the lowest hanging fruits are Hawaiian plants, a lot of California plants, a lot of species that actually have fairly restricted ranges for which conservation measures aren't going to be really expensive. So it depends what game you want to play. If you want to play a numbers game, our current portfolio of how we spend money is totally wrong. If we want to address conflict, if we want to spend money on the species that get a lot of public attention, that are high profile, we're probably spending money on the right portfolio of species. But we can't claim that we're going to recover a whole bunch of species under the current spending portfolio, right? We can't have it both ways. So that's money. The other thing I want to talk about with recovery is the recovery plans, right? So the recovery plans are the roadmap for how to get a species recovered. And without a recovery plan, one could argue that conservation is sort of just lost somewhere in the ether. You know, it's sort of searching in dark places, trying to figure out what to do. So this is a study that my colleague and I published earlier this year, which for the first time looked pretty comprehensively at every recovery plan to look at the timing between when a species is listed and when it gets a recovery plan, as well as how many species even have recovery plans in the first place. So what we found was that 25% of all species that are eligible for recovery plans still don't have a recovery plan. That number is actually not as bad as I thought. I actually thought it would be something like 40%. 25% is not good, but it's not atrocious, right? But what is problematic is if you look at the black line and compare it to the dotted blue line, what you see again is this big push to get species listed, because it's relatively not very expensive to get species listed, but it's pretty expensive and time consuming to write a recovery plan for a species. And so you see this lag, right? Where the number of listed species, increases quite a bit, but the number of species with recovery plans is much, much slower. And a different way to visualize this is this figure from the study, which is if you look at the year in which a species was listed and the proportion of the species from that year that have a recovery plan, it's really tanking since roughly 2000, right? And this situation is getting worse unless somehow we figure out a much cheaper and quicker way to do recovery plans, or, and this is not something I would not necessarily advocate for, we slow down the rate at which species are getting listed and spend that money on writing recovery plans. And some of the members of the House that I've worked with, some of the Republicans, are interested in that strategy of taking money away from listing to fund recovery plans. And so the question is that a good strategy? So you have fewer species that are listed, but of the ones that are listed, you're doing more follow through, right? And it's really controversial within the conservation community. There's arguments pro and con for both of those strategies. But this is really what the data set are finally telling us. So this is the timing of recovery plans. This is also a pretty dismal picture. We, for the first time, looked at how old these recovery plans are. The median age is 21 years. It's old enough to vote, basically. And so you can imagine in 21 years, how much has changed about our knowledge of the species and the threats to the species. And these documents have not been updated in that long of a time. We found that roughly 10% of all plans are over 30 years old, and I've reviewed a bunch of these 30-year-old plans, and they're practically useless, right, by and large. So this is a real issue, because if we can't get these plans updated and relevant to decision makers, to conservation partners, they're not relying on these plans as much because they see that it's so outdated and it doesn't reflect the best and most current information on the species. So again, these are some of the challenges with recovery planning. And then the final challenge I want to talk about before I talk a bit about solutions is this paper I did 3 years ago that was quite fun to do. And it gets back to this consultation process that David talked about earlier and I mentioned earlier. And so if you remember, there's these two prohibitions under the consultation process. Federal agencies can't jeopardize a species, and they can't destroy the species' critical habitat. And the reason the consultation process and this jeopardy prohibition has been really controversial over the years largely started with this situation. So this is the Snail Darter. And some of you who follow the ESA might have known that the Snail Darter more or less halted the construction of the Tellico Dam in the Little Tennessee River, because the completion of the dam would flood, at the time, the only known population of the species. And so it was a situation clearly of jeopardy. And jeopardy means likely to appreciably diminish the survival and recovery of the species. So flooding the entire species habitat would certainly meet the definition of appreciably diminish the survival prospects of the species. And so ever since this time, and certainly when I was in law school, what I learned about the ESA was the Tellico Dam and just how powerful the jeopardy prohibition was. And because of this sort of almost myth surrounding the jeopardy prohibition, oftentimes the controversy around the ESA and what we hear in congressional hearings is, it's the jeopardy prohibition stopping these projects. This is why we don't have faster commutes, because highway projects are being stopped or slowed down. This is why the economy is tanking, because we don't have jobs in silviculture and in ranching because the ESA is stopping all of these projects. These are all talking points from some of the folks who want to reform the ESA. So the question is this actually correct? And it was really hard to figure out the answer to this question, because every year there are roughly 10,000 projects that are reviewed under the Endangered Species Act. So it's a huge data set. And I actually, we just got really lucky because the Fish and Wildlife Service was tracking this data set, and I was able to download all of it and analyze it. So here's a visual. If every 2 projects were represented by 1 dot, this is how many projects were reviewed and approved under Section 7 of the ESA from 2010 to 2017. This is the 88,290 figure that David mentioned earlier. And so of these dots, the next question is, how many of these projects were actually deemed likely to harm a species and therefore require a more detailed review by the government? I was astounded at the number. It was only 7% of projects. And what this actually means is that only 7% of projects were actually found likely to result in take of a species, which to me is still really hard to believe to this day. That of the 88,000 projects around the country, ranging from filling in wetlands to clearing thousands of acres of habitat, only 7% of them were likely to result in any take of a species. So that itself was pretty interesting. And then the final question was, how many of those projects actually resulted in a jeopardy call, right? This is the answer. It was 2 out of 88,290. And so this was sort of the big revelation that by and large, the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is not calling jeopardy anymore these days. And there's a bunch of theories as to why. And there are both benefits to them not calling jeopardy and some really, really significant problems for conservation for them not to call jeopardy. And we can talk a little bit about this in a Q&A session. But by and large, there were only 2 jeopardy findings out of nearly 90,000 consultations. And so how many findings were there that the critical habitat would be destroyed or adversely modified? So remember, this is what all of the opponents of the ESA are claiming is happening under critical habitat designation. Well, if we take that circle and we cut it in half, that is the number of destruction and adverse modification findings. It was just 1, and that one was actually rescinded by the Fish and Wildlife Service after they lost in court on a different environmental issue. So by and large, what we found was that the Fish and Wildlife Service is not using findings of jeopardy or adverse modification of critical habitat to stop or significantly delay projects. And so I actually testified before Congress saying that, look, this is evidence that the ESA is not having these detrimental impacts that a lot of the opponents of the ESA claim, right? What I did not testify before Congress is that this is a real problem for conservation in my view. That I think this is actually a pattern of the agency being far too permissive with a lot of projects and simply not being able to say no to some really, really harmful projects, some of which I've actually seen in my work at Defenders of Wildlife. So it goes both ways, because on the one hand, politically, this is a great argument, right? That the ESA doesn't conflict with economic development, with jobs and so forth. That's the win-win sort of we want to hear. At the same time, I truly believe that this is also one reason we don't see more species being recovered. Because if there's not enough money to conserve the species, and you have what's called the death by 1,000 cuts, which is a little slit here, a little slit there, a little slit there, no real ability to track the cumulative effects of all of those impacts, then you have basically species that are slipping further and further back from recovery, and they're actually doing worse sometimes after they're listed, right? So that was an interesting finding. We also got the location of a lot of those projects. And so one area of interest is, and an area where technology can really come into play is, you can run satellite images over all of these projects now. And you can actually verify the footprint of the project and whether it's complying with the terms of its permit. So that was another project I started at Defenders because of the availability of satellite images from NASA as well as the European Space Agency, all for free, being served up through Google Earth Engine. One strategy in the future is if the Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government could provide GIS files of the exact location of all of these projects, you can create an automatic an algorithm that automatically detects change on those projects. And whenever there's a change that exceeds a certain threshold, as a regulator or as a watchdog group, you can get an alert to say, hey, look, there's a change that's higher than the threshold I set. Someone needs to take a closer look at this. And this can help solve the problem of compliance and enforcement. Because if there's one thing that government really, really doesn't have money to do, it's to do monitoring and compliance and enforcement of these federal laws. Both because it's politically very difficult to do that on private lands in some very conservative parts of the US, but also because they simply don't have the staff to do that, right? It takes a lot of work to drive around in a pickup truck and inspect, 10,000 sites a year multiplied by 20 years of permits, right? So this is where technology actually, in my view, is the solution to a lot of these issues. So I've started to segue a little bit about solutions. In the interest of time, I'm going to talk about just some of the solutions we've been working on earlier. And they really range from really basic and non-controversial to super controversial. And I'll just talk about two of them, and then we can do questions and answers. So one of them is actually to take the concept of Wikipedia. So I said earlier these recovery plans are median age is 22 years, right? One reason is that they're these Adobe PDF documents that no one wants to touch, because to update it, you basically have to update the entire PDF document, repost it, and the government doesn't have a process for how to expeditiously do that without seeking public notice and comment on the entire plan. Something I started when I was at Defenders of Wildlife, working with the Department of Defense, is why not take the concept of Wikipedia, where the federal government can just log in and just make a change to an aspect of the recovery plan that is not actually statutorily mandated under the ESA. In other words, it's a part of the plan that's about background information on the species biology or threats, right? Which can be changing all the time. Just go in, make the change. Just like Wikipedia, they track every single change, for eternity. So it's not like someone can, sort of clandestinely go in and make the change. And very quickly, you have a living document. You have a living recovery plan that's always up to date, right? So it's no longer 21 years. The current indigo snake recovery plan is 28 years old. So this is how bad the situation is. So this is a really basic idea. This is just using internet technology and the concept of Wikipedia and applying it to conservation. I'll go to the other extreme. And this is, again, from that 2016 paper from Dr. Leah Gerber, which looks at how we allocate money for endangered species. And this is a really interesting set of findings, because what we have is we can look at how much it costs to recover a species or conserve a species, whether a species is getting more or less money than what the recovery plan anticipates, and then whether the species is doing better, worse, or nothing's really happening. And so it's not surprising here if, this little pointer here, we have a lot of species in this interesting term called injurious neglect, in which they're basically being neglected because there's not enough money for the species, and that neglect is to the injury of the species. So those species actually have negative scores for their status. Then we have some species that are deemed, and you can agree or disagree with this assessment, but I think the categories are generally correct, costly failures. So these are species for which you're spending actually more money than what the recovery plan anticipates, and the status that the government is reporting is actually negative. You have costly successes, like this Halia plant here, which is a species for which there's more money than what the recovery plan anticipates, and it's doing well. And then, of course, you have some cost-effective species like this smoky maton. So there's this big question, right, about, okay, we don't have enough money to conserve all the species, right? As I said, we only have 20% right now, and somehow, unless Congress is really enlightened and is going to throw, hundreds of millions of dollars into the ESA, this is a situation we're stuck with. And the question is there a better way to start moving species around? Is there a better way for us to maybe stop spending money on certain species and spend it on others. My personal preference is that I think there's a lot of opportunity in these injurious neglect species to possibly move them into this cost-effective but improving status. But it's going to mean we have to start taking money away from other species, and no one wants to play God, right? That's the problem. This is one of the most controversial aspects within the NGO community. Within my Defenders of Wildlife, there were very, very intense debates about what we should do in this situation. But the bottom line is that this is happening every day anyway. The federal government is making these decisions all the time. And so do we want it to be transparent? Do we want it to be optimized? Do we want it to be informative? Or do we want to continue letting the government use its own calculus that even I don't understand today after studying the system? I think a much more explicit process is much better because it's more transparent and it allows us to optimize conservation. But it also means that we have to make some really, really difficult choices. So let me stop there. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to skip some of this other work here. Here's my email if anyone wants to follow up with me. I'm in Washington, D.C. So if any of you are ever in town and wanted to geek out about ESA, I'm happy to entertain your questions. But we have about 10 minutes, so I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Questions for Jake? And Jake, I'll call on the first person, but then let you take the
great.
questions.
Thank you.
So I have 3 questions that speak to my ignorance on all of this. So out of the 2,200 endangered or threatened species, what percentage is that of all existing species?
Just globally?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, David probably can provide a better answer to this question.
What percentage is, how many species are there?
Described globally today, a little under 2 million species have been described. If we guesstimate how many species exist in the world we haven't yet described, that would probably push the 2 million number up closer to about 10 million.
Right. And then, interestingly, in the U.S., right? So the question is, how many more species could be listed in the U.S.? So if you look at the nature serves ranking of G1, G2 species in the U.S., which we did as part of this 2016 study, it's a little over 10,000 in the U.S. So long story short is there is no shortage of work for the listing program. Yes.
And the second question is, when you see an increase in the lichens going up, after the 80s,
yeah.
Is that increase in knowledge or is it increase in vulnerability?
Yeah, it's a question. It's a good question. I have not actually studied this question. I don't know if you have a better sense of exactly why.
The only clue I have is that when we looked, this is years ago when I was looking at research, when we looked at the species that had disappeared from the list, it turned out that many of them were either gone by the time they were put on the list or were so rare by the time they got on the list, there was little prospect of saving them, which tells me that the threats had been happening for a long, long time, and we were only now catching up to it, so that the ongoing harm may have been much, much less than the prior harm that put them in the situation they were in.
Right. My guess is, if we actually look at the nature serve list, probably a lot of the remaining species to be listed are going to be plants and invertebrates. And it may be that the environmental groups that are petitioned to get these species listed finally sort of caught up to just the sheer number of plants and invertebrates that did need to be listed, right? A lot of this is about low-hanging fruits, because when you petition for a species to be listed, you don't want to waste your time, right? You want to spend it on species that you actually think the federal government is going to list. So I think we see a lot of these low-hanging fruits that are listed. Yep. Great. Other questions? Yes, back here.
Are there some efforts to prioritize or rank these 2,400 species based on maybe how many of these are close substitutes, or how easy is it to save them?
It's a great question, and the question really underscores the distinction between the federal government's policy and what they do in practice.
Right.
Because they do, in fact, have a policy since the 1980s in which they actually have to prioritize which species get recovery plans first and how money is supposed to be spent. And one of the factors is uniqueness. So a monotypic genus would get a higher score than, for example, a distinct population segment. A species that's in conflict with development is supposed to get a higher score than one that's not. And there's actually a numeric system that every species gets a score. The problem is the federal government doesn't actually follow that system. And part of the reason is there's no mandate requirement to do so. And there's no legal ability for a nonprofit organization like mine to force the government to do so. So it's one of the fascinating things about the ESA. What you see in the law and in policy doesn't actually necessarily mean what the government does in practice. So there was good thinking, but no follow through. Yeah. Next question?
I was just wondering, when you were talking about some of the comments that are being made on the Hill, you were talking about people who are concerned about how many of the species are becoming recovered.
Yes.
But it seems to me that the real comparison that we're interested in, right, is how many of these species would have already gone extinct, or how many would be succeeding or declining if there weren't any of these species.
Had the ESA not been in place. Yep.
Have people done that?
In fact, someone has. And in the 90s, there was a study that basically concluded there would be several hundred species that likely would have gone extinct. I don't remember the exact number. I don't know if you remember, David. That would have gone extinct had the ESA not been in place, right? And so that's basically looking at a situation that never happened, of course. And conservation groups also have used that messaging in the past. But you also have to keep in mind the reformers of the ESA aren't proposing to have no ESA, right? So it's not a comparison between no ESA and the ESA we have. It's a comparison between the ESA we have today and one that they think would work better for conserving species. And so the question is, well, is there a strategy, actually one that's going to lead to more conservation? What we've seen on the Hill right now, and I've been working on this for over a decade, is every single year the strategies that are offered would actually make conservation even more difficult. And unfortunately, the supporters of the ESA, and what it's going to be a lot of the Democratic offices, have not actually offered their own legislation for how the ESA could be improved. So they're in this very responsive mode, where basically Republicans every year are offering bills to amend the ESA, and a lot of the Democratic offices we work with say, oh, well, that's not needed. The ESA is just fine. It just needs more money. And I actually don't think that's true. I don't think they think it's true. I can think of 10 ways to amend the ESA right now that would make it more effective. And yet, the champions of the Endangered Species Act aren't proactively coming forward to offer any ideas, even if those ideas don't go anywhere, even if they don't make it into legislation. But just start the discourse, because the opponents of the ESA are controlling the public messaging right now, right? We're in this responsive mode of responding to their message that the ESA is a failure. And we have to say, oh, no, it's not. It's 99% effective. And what the conservation community has not done is actually to take hold of the messaging frame and sort of frame it in our own way. And there's various reasons for that I can talk about afterwards. But that's a lot of the political dynamic right now. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Two strategies that I've seen conservation groups try to take with endangered species is to try to harness the really expensive species like the salmon species, where there's a lot of funding,
right,
and try to implement projects that will help a wider range of species.
Right.
So trying to take advantage of the expensive endangered species as like an umbrella species.
Right.
To protect many species. I'm wondering if you think that has been effective to any degree.
Yep.
A lot of these groups kind of fall on where the money is. And
yep.
The second question is the flip side of that. I've also noticed a lot of groups purposefully avoiding endangered species and doing, especially if they're trying to do voluntary conservation work with private landowners, trying to avoid endangered species.
Right.
Almost with the same idea, if we just don't make it about this controversial issue, we can get more conservation done.
Yep.
That could then serve as an umbrella to help more endangered species.
Yep.
I'm curious if you think either of those are actually valid or
yeah, really great questions. It shows you all have definitely done some research on this topic. So to answer your first question, basically this is the broader concept of proxy or umbrella species or surrogates. And my sense, although actually probably a lot of you in the room will have a much better sense of this than I will, is I think the record is really mixed. So for example, I don't think the gray wolf, even though it's a wide-ranging species, is actually a good surrogate for a lot of other species, because the conservative wolf, you basically just need to stop shooting. right? You really don't need to do much of any habitat restoration. Versus, let's just say, the greater sage grouse, right? There was this whole effort to try to get the species to avoid the ESA listing. There were really some 250 species in its ecosystem that would benefit from the conservation measures of the sage grouse. If you look at the Pacific salmon, right, and I've done this before, and you look at the maps for where endangered species occur, and then you look at the Pacific salmon, I wouldn't place my money in the Pacific salmon because there's not optimal overlap between the areas of the salmon's range and where a lot of highly imperiled listed species are. I think salmon is driven largely by political concerns, and argument E here is probably a little bit of after-the-fact justification. To answer your second question, that is absolutely a trend we see, which is trying to conserve species without the regulatory hammer of the ESA. And so there's a bunch of initiatives coming out of the Southeast, for example. One is called Conservation Without Conflict, in which the federal government is working with states and private landowners before a species ever even needs listing under the ESA to say, this is a species that's in decline. None of us want to see the federal government drop the regulatory hammer. What can we do to try to prevent that from happening and come up with a pretty good outcome, right? That works for private landowners, works for the DOT in the state. And that's a pattern I see throughout the country right now, and I'm involved in some of those projects. I think generally they're fairly successful. One of the big challenges is we still don't have good monitoring to see whether, in fact, biologically, they're producing the outcomes expected for species. Yeah.
Jake, I want to thank you so much.
Yes,
really
thank you.
informative.
All right, great. Well, thanks for all of your interest.
Jake will be around up here trying to eat his lunch for a few minutes. If you have questions for him, thanks so much.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.